There's the character of Mud, who's not even a real character. He is a dead man in Yossarian's tent who never is seen on the page. He's killed on a mission before he's even allowed to check in, and through a bureaucratic technicality, he is written off as never really existing. And this death shows us the way bureaucracy treats humans during war, as being rather unimportant pieces of the machine. Some of the more ambiguous characters include Milo, who we'll come back to, but also Doc Danica, who's sort of amusing and sympathetic to Yossarian, but doesn't really ever help him. Doc Danica dies due to a technicality when he, shirking his duty, is supposed to be on a plane that is shot down. Because of that, he ends up in sort of another world of not existing according to the military bureaucracy, but still being at war. He constantly laments his own problems and he refuses to treat anyone, and yet in a moment of crisis, when Milo is bombing his own unit, Doc Danica jumps to action and suddenly shows himself to be a true doctor, someone who does care about his fellow man. Danica himself is suggestive of the preserving yet destructive power of unrelenting self-interest. Yes, Doc Danica survives, but almost everything that he wants or likes in life is destroyed around him. Dobbs is a lousy pilot. Dobbs wants to kill Cathcart out of self-preservation because he sees Cathcart as the reason they keep having to fly missions. However, he won't kill Cathcart unless Yossarian tells him that it's okay to do so, because he lacks initiative. He is partially responsible for the death of Snowden because of his poor flying, and he too dies on a mission, suggesting the danger of lacking a strong moral compass. Perhaps if Dobbs had acted, he wouldn't have died, and perhaps Snowden wouldn't have died. Although killing Cathcart may not be a particularly moral action. Major is certainly not a bad guy. However, his pointless promotion and his unwillingness to deal with people makes him a little bit ambiguous. He doesn't say or do anything necessarily negative, but he doesn't actually do anything very positive either. He shows how the military bureaucracy does not see individuals. In fact, it was a machine-made error that promoted him, even though it seemed that the IBM machine might have had a sense of humor in promoting him. Hupel is a 15-year-old lousy pilot who lied to get into the war and is also partially responsible for the death of Snowden, and his presence suggests the ignorance of desiring to go to war, that when these young, idealistic people are persuaded to do something like go to war, negative things follow. And then there's Milo Minderbender. Milo is controversial. He's a morally ambiguous capitalist. One of the problems with him is that he's certainly a profiteer. We sort of like Milo because he attempts to make war about something logical, profit. Certainly Mr. Clark might like him some Milo Minderbender. This does make him a little bit sympathetic. He's trying to find rational reasons to be at war. However, we ultimately see that he puts profit above the value of life and becomes symbolic of out-of-control greed. His syndicate, which ironically has a sort of communist-sounding name, is actually hyper-capitalist. He says things like everybody has a share and what is good for the syndicate is good for everybody, but his actions show that the only thing that drives him is the bottom line, is profit. The problem with Milo is that there ultimately cannot be logic in illogic, that he is trying to make something that Joseph Heller believes is completely absurd, war, and trying to make it rational and sensible, and Heller sees no way for that to actually work. And so you have a character like Milo who ends up bombing his own unit, which is probably the most treasonous, horrible thing that someone could do. This basically makes him a pretty bad, almost evil character, although we do understand and he does have a sort of backwards rationale for why he does it, and is ultimately let off as he justifies his rationale to the government powers that be. Some of the fairly bad guys include Havemeyer, who is symbolic of blind, stubborn obedience to orders, and he ultimately threatens the lives of those who fly with him. And here we start to get into the title-holding bad guys. We have Colonel Whitcomb, whose letter-writing campaign is just ridiculous and symbolic of petty self-interest triumphing over loyalty and truth. There's Lieutenant and eventually General Sheiskov, who is obsessed with marching, which is symbolic of the formal and artificial order of the military over true leadership. There's ex-Private First Class Wintergreen, who is one of those ultimate middlemen in bureaucracies, a gatekeeper. Somehow he always pops up in between other people, and he helps to symbolize the internal politics and arbitrary decision-making that keep true progress from happening within a bureaucracy. But the real bad guys, who are always recognizable by rank, Colonel Cathcart, who is part of that bureaucracy above Yossarian, the guy who keeps raising mission numbers again and again and again so that his sheet looks better, so that he looks like a better leader, suggesting that his men are willing to fight for him and go off to fight even above and beyond the call of duty, when in reality he's forcing them to do so. Cathcart symbolizes the danger of unrelenting self-interest and dehumanization. There's General Peckham, who is in a constant struggle to overcome another general, General Dreidel, and this is suggestive of those internal rivalries that happen not just in war or in military bureaucracies, but pretty much within every organization. How no matter how unified their goals ultimately are, how these little infighting rivalries can have serious consequences. He tends to have a style over substance methodology to him, and his memos are symbolic of the style over substance values that bureaucracy seems to hold. Colonel Black founds the Great Loyalty Oath Crusade, which should have been ironic to a World War II story because, of course, it's an incredible moment of patriotic fanaticism, which is also known as fascism, which is, of course, what Hitler and Mussolini really made their own. Arfie is one of the more unlikable characters in the book. For me, probably the most unlikable character, as his crime is the most personal and obvious. He rapes and murders a maid. However, throughout, and even as he talks of his own innocence, after admitting raping and murdering the maid, he basically suggests that because he is wealthy and from a powerful family, that nothing he does is really his fault or something that he could be blamed for. His refrain, "Not good old Arfie," is infuriating and yet speaks of the blind privilege that he believes he holds. So there you have it. Quite a lengthy discussion of a lengthy book. One that I hope that you enjoyed. It truly is a very funny book, and I'm sorry if the fact that you had to read it for class sort of ruined that for you. But let's be honest, would you have picked that book up on your own? In the end, Joseph Heller tells us some very interesting things about the experience of war. That even noble war, a war as noble as World War II, is not necessarily seen as that noble by the individuals forced to fight and possibly die for it. Furthermore, Heller's interpretations of bureaucracy are continuously relevant. I am sorry to say that if you ever hold a job someday and have to work for somebody, you will start to recognize the truth of Heller's critiques of bureaucracy. It doesn't matter the size of the bureaucracy, they are all the same. Just to try to sum up, it is likely that Heller would like us to take away from reading his book that we should think twice about sending people to war, no matter the cause, no matter how honorable or how necessary it may seem. It's difficult for us to really anticipate and understand the human costs of being at war. And that's what Catch-22 seems to try to bring to life in front of us, is what happens to men and women at war. This is not to say that we should never, ever, ever go to war. But like some of the war poems that we read earlier in the poetry units, it is to remind us that there are costs that we don't always consider, that sometimes get lost in our patriotism or our fear or our zeal for a cause. If you liked Catch-22, there is a sequel called Closing Time, written about Yossarian some 30 years after the war. I don't honestly recommend it. I do, however, recommend reading one of our extra credit reads, which is Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut also served in World War II and wrote around the time of the Vietnam War and shared many of Heller's ideas, as well as his sense of humor.
to the race.